Hello, welcome back. I'm Dawn Westmoreland from Asheville, North Carolina. My show is the Empowered Whistleblower Radio Show. Oftentimes people ask me, why did you name it the Empowered Whistleblower Radio Show? Because we blow the whistle on workplace issues, because the bottom line is everyone deserves to work in a safe and respectful work environment. I come from WPVM FM LP 103.7, The Voice of Asheville. It's syndicated. Anywhere you're at, you can stream it. And I want to go ahead and begin with incivility is still a problem in the workplace. And I have interviewed Lisa Bowman before, but it's been a while and she's written a book and I would like to welcome her back. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning, Dawn. Thanks for having me back. It's great to be here again.
Yes. So I interviewed you before and I knew a lot about your past, and your book was so comprehensive. And I was so impressed because, I understand workplace bullying. I've worked in it myself. I've dealt with it myself. Tell the listeners what it's about, who you are. Just give us a little background on you, Lisa.
Sure, happy to. So I was the global chief marketing officer for the world's largest nonprofit. I had been there for 5 years, and about halfway through my tenure, I started to endure some harassment from a coworker, one of my peers on the executive team. Went on for quite a while. I tried to just manage it on my own. And when it subsequently began to impact other women on my team, specifically 2 younger women, women of color, I went to HR about it. Subsequently had to go back to HR shortly thereafter on my own behalf because my harasser had crossed a line with me. And from the moment I went to HR, I became the target of a pattern of really systemic retaliation from the CEO. Who spent the majority of 2019 trying to get me to quit. And when that failed, because I'm not wired to do that, he terminated me in early 2020.
So Lisa, what I'm hearing is that you experience workplace harassment, sexual harassment, which is different than just regular harassment. And then you asked for help, you went to HR, and the next thing you know is you're out of your job.
That's correct.
Yes. And this happens a lot. And, I've been in human resources over 31 years, the past 10 years as a consultant. Do you think going to HR asking for help in hindsight was the right thing to do?
I think that it was what I had to do because we have processes in place, right? Every company has processes and policies that you're obligated to follow. And in my case, I followed the process, I followed the policy. Are there things I would have done differently? Hindsight always being 2020. Absolutely. I would have approached it a little bit more differently with HR, knowing what I know now. I would have documented things a little bit differently, and I might have actually sought legal counsel while I was engaged in the HR process. But I didn't know to do those things. And as you mentioned, that is exactly why I wrote a book. I learned so much through this process that I wanted to share that with other people because, like you said, this happens every day. And I think that we don't know how to navigate it. And no disrespect to the HR folks, the policies all tell us we have to report it to HR. But I think, one of the biggest things that I learned candidly is that when something like this happens, HR is not your friend. They're there to protect the company, not protect the individual. And so, as a marketer, I kind of jokingly said this in the book, but I really believe it's true, regardless of what HR is called. And, today it's called a lot of different things, right? It's human resources, it's people resources, people and culture, human capital. It's a branding exercise because they really are not there for the people. They're there for the company.
Okay. And, with my background, and I've seen a lot working in HR, And most companies that are larger tend to have HR reporting directly to the director or the company manager. So that HR person or people are working for the leader. And I got a question because, I've seen it over and over too, Lisa, where HR is not there for you. And you gave us some good examples of HR. I mean, I've even had people say HR stands for human rats. And I'm like, okay, all right, well, there's a lot of HR people who need to get it together, and they need to stand up to the boss. So would you share with the listeners from your experience, what would you do differently? Because you mentioned documentation, legal, and some other things. Because I know people listen in because they learn and they also care about people who have been victimized.
I think that a couple of the things that I mentioned, documentation is obviously really important. I think that there's a right way to do it, which is to be really specific, right? When you go to HR and when you have an issue. One of the things that I recommend is prior to just setting up a meeting with HR, send HR written documentation saying, I am requesting a meeting with you to specifically discuss this issue, which occurred with this person on this date, so that you're beginning that paper trail right from the beginning. And then make sure that as you're going through the process, you're continuing to keep documentation of what occurred, what conversations you had, who may have been around to see what happened. And one of the other things that people don't think about is if you're in a situation, whether you're being discriminated against, harassed, sexually harassed, whatever it is, how that made you feel. Because in my case, as my harassment began to ratchet up, what I noticed is that I was actually having physical reactions to my harasser. I would have what I refer to as mini anxiety attacks when I had encounters with him. My heart rate would escalate. I would have stomach pains. So I didn't know and I didn't think to necessarily document those until the very end, as this was happening more frequently and I began to recognize it for what it was. So I think that's one thing we don't think about is pay attention to how you're feeling physically. Did you have some type of physical or emotional reaction to the interaction that you just had? And make sure that you document that.
And I'm so glad you talked about documentation because it really is key, Lisa. If you go and see a lawyer's going to ask, what evidence do you have? So you had documentation. So I'd like to know, when you said you gave HR, this documentation, was it by email or did you write a letter and hand it to them?
So as I had said, learning and hindsight are always 2020. I had a lot of my conversations verbally with them. The HR person with whom I dealt was one of my peers on the executive team. And so I went to her trusting the person, the process, the policy to work. I did start documenting at some point through that process, but I did not document upfront the way I recommend to the listeners that they do. You want to start documenting from minute one. So when that first issue happens, I think sometimes, particularly as women, we tend to doubt ourselves and we tend to wonder, did I read too much into that? Did this really just happen? However, you never know, because if it happens again, right, it may turn into a pattern of something that needs to be reported. So even if you're not sure, just write it down. Where you were, when it happened, who was around that may have witnessed it, as I said, how it made you feel, and hang on to that. Hopefully, it may have been an isolated incident. You'll never need that documentation. But in the event that you do, you want to keep track of that from the word go.
Okay. So you mostly just documented it and kept it to yourself, and then you later had it to, I'm assuming, did you hand it over to your attorney?
I did. I handed it over to my attorney. It was used to file my EEOC charges. And quite frankly, it was used for the outline and the framework of my book because I needed to make sure that I was being factual and truthful in the book about the incidents that had occurred. And sometimes you can't trust memory. So it was very helpful to have that documentation and be able to go back to it.
Lisa, I know what the EEOC is with my background, but for anybody who does not know what EEOC is and they'd like to know what it means and what they do, would you share with us, please?
Sure. So the EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and that is the federal agency with whom in most states you're required to go through prior to being able to file charges against an employer. So the EEOC really serves as that neutral third party that will look at your charge. They will ask the employer for a response known as a position statement. They will take a look at what's been submitted by both sides and then make a determination as to whether or not they believe that there is cause for the employee to sue. It is not a legal process that you go through. They don't make a determination of guilt, but they will look at your case and say either we believe that this employee has provided enough documentation that we're going to issue a right to sue. Sometimes it's what's known as a right to sue with cause. They'll issue a determination of cause, which means that they take the case very seriously. And then in a very small percentage of cases, about 1% of them, the EEOC will actually litigate the case on behalf of the employee if they find it to be a serious enough potential violation from the employer.
I'm glad you said that, Lisa, because, you know, even one person could be credible and they come forth with all the evidence, proof, witnesses or no witnesses, documentation. But as you said, I'm so happy you said that if multiple people may come forward and it's a real big issue, and then they go out and litigate. So that's really important for people to know because, you know, there may be somebody out there saying, well, this is happening to me and I see it's happening to 10 other women and men too, because they also get sexually harassed.
They do.
Let's brought that up.
Yeah, men do get sexually harassed too, and unfortunately, we tend to forget that sometimes because
Yeah.
it's a smaller percentage. But I do want to acknowledge that does happen. And to your point, with the EEOC, in my case, there were 3 charges filed within a 1-year period. So myself and 2 other women, and I think it's the old adage of where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yes.
So that's another thing that I would encourage people to think about is that if you are experiencing this, I would say that there's a decent probability you may not be the only one. And therefore trying to understand quietly and navigate that, which is sometimes a difficult thing, but trying to understand if this is happening to other people. Sometimes there's both strength and safety in numbers. And so if in fact you find that this is going on, that this is more widespread than just you, being able to go to HR as a group, provided that this is the same behavior, same person, often carries some merit as well.
Now, in your book, and I'm going to let you tell the listeners the name of your book. I mean, I just thought, wow, what a name.
I'm always careful because you have to be careful about using bad words on the radio. But the name of my book is actually Harasshole, a cautionary tale of my time at America's favorite charity, because that is how I used to refer to my harasser. I would refer to him as my harasshole. And so it seemed appropriate that when calling out the story, this is a story about my interaction with that person and subsequently how that journey worked out for me. So it seemed like an appropriate title for the book.
I mean, it had me curious, and I read your book, as you know, and I commend you for your strength and your tenacity because many people do not speak up because they don't want to lose their job or they're afraid of retaliation. And retaliation is a really big thing. All you have to do is go to the EEOC's website and type in retaliation, and you will find there are a lot of retaliation cases. So tell us some of the main things that happen, some of the bigger things of retaliation, because you certainly suffered retaliation for
I
speaking
did.
up.
I did. So, It's interesting too, Dawn, that 75% of the harassment cases that are reported to the EEOC also include charges of retaliation. So it's
Yes.
very, very common. In my particular case, there are a number of different things that happened. Things like having resources removed from me, but not having the work taken away. As a matter of fact, the resources that were removed were actually given to my harasser. But I was responsible for the work product and still maintaining that work. My performance reviews were downgraded with absolutely no reason, no explanation, and on things that were candidly very subjective. Or I was told that I was not performing in things that weren't actually even part of my job, by my job description and by what was in my performance reviews. I was left out of meetings, taken off the agenda for board meetings, whereas I had always presented to the board. But cut out of meetings, cut out of decisions, candidly, just everything to try and pull my feet out from under me. And I truly believe that all of this was done in an effort to just make it easy and get me to quit. That if I was overworked, I was overwhelmed, I was being beaten up for things that didn't make sense, that I would just throw in the towel and call it a day. And that would have cleaned up the problem nice and tidy. Unfortunately, I'm not wired that way. Um, and I guess I was raised with a really good sense of Midwestern values and what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
And so, while I had been enduring the harassment for about 15 months, like I said, I didn't go to HR until I had two other women on my team come to me with issues with the same person and inappropriate behavior. And so that's when I went to HR. Number one, because as a people leader, by policy, I was obligated to report what was even a suspected case of harassment or discrimination. The second thing is, as a person, as a female leader, if I had not stood up for these two younger women that were not in a position where they were going to go to HR about a white male C-suite executive, that would have made me a really poor leader and it would have made me complicit in enabling this behavior. And so, on a personal level, even if those policies hadn't existed, I still would have felt that personal obligation to raise this issue to HR on behalf of those women.
Yeah. And that says a lot about your character, Lisa. Thank you for doing that, because so many people would look the other way and say, it's not my problem. I don't want to get tangled up in it. So big kudos to you. That's really huge.
Thank you.
Now, when you wrote the book, we're going to jump ahead a little bit. You had talked, and I don't want to do the spoiler. I want you to do the spoiler. You reached out and you got some high level people supporting you, advising you. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, we can. We can. So I was very fortunate in that right after this happened, I happened to be at an event where Gretchen Carlson was speaking. And Gretchen Carlson, for those who may not know her, is probably one of the most visible public faces of Me Too. She was a reporter on Fox News who had suffered some pretty serious sexual harassment. Um, and I was fortunate enough in the fact that I had made a connection with Gretchen, who, to Gretchen's credit, this has become her life's work and her mission. And she leaned in and she wrapped her arms around me and helped me and advised me. And that resulted in a bit of media coverage, candidly, about my story towards the end of 2020. And that continued until 2021. And, as I wrote the book, Gretchen was kind enough to write the foreword for me. Gretchen has really been a tireless advocate on behalf of women. There was legislation passed, federal legislation that she got passed in February of this year that made it illegal for companies to mandate forced arbitration as the only solution in cases of workplace sexual harassment and assault. And there is another piece of legislation that she's working on that has to deal with NDAs or non-disclosure
Disclosure
agreements
agreements, yeah.
being signed up front in cases of harassment or assault in the workplace. So these are really big forward steps to protect people in the workplace. And I'm just very thankful to her. I'm very grateful to her for the work that she's done on behalf of everybody else that's dealt with this.
Yeah, and that's so huge, is we need people to reach out to Congress, change laws, make things forcible, and let people know what's going on. We can't just hush. And I just have to say, coming from my HR background, I've always known that even though you might sign a forced arbitration where things have to be done, in-house, that might be bullying and things like that, which is not illegal in the workplace still as of today. There's many advocates are out there trying to get laws on it. But what I'm amazed many people, Lisa, don't know is that discrimination, if there's ever any protected class of discrimination, sexual harassment, things like that, it doesn't matter what the policies are in the workplace. You can go directly to the EEOC. That's your right. And a lot of people think, oh, I have to do everything in-house. Well, no, that is not true. That is not true. And people can also, check with their, legal sources too on that. So moving forward, was it hard to write your book?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. And the reason I say that is it was sort of a funny story how it came about. I never set out to write a book. That was really kind of the last thing that was on my radar. But I had been contacted by a publisher in May of 2021 who had read some of the media coverage and asked if I might be interested in writing a book. And I initially said no. I said no for three reasons. Number one, I wasn't sure who would actually read the book, right? I'm not a public figure. I'm Lisa Bowman, private citizen. Nobody knows who I am. Who's even going to see this book or read it? Number two was having to walk back through the emotional journey again to write the book. I wasn't really sure I wanted to do that. And the third thing was the whole notion of writing a book was actually super intimidating. I remember asking them, tell me about a book. Like, how many pages? What's the word count that we're talking about? And they said, oh, maybe 200 pages, 50,000 words. I said, oh my gosh, there's no way I can write that.
Yeah.
Newsflash, a 312-page book with, I think, 67,000 words. But once I started writing, which I really did for me more so than to write a book. I kind of told the publisher, no, thank you. But shortly after that, I started writing because I thought it might be helpful for me to document my journey in narrative form. And on day one, when I started writing, I wrote 5,000 words. By the end of that week, I had a 15,000 word draft and ended up writing the book in full in 4 months. I started it in early June of 2021, finished it the beginning of September of 2021. And then there was, some fits and starts and putting it on hold for some legal reasons and some other things. But one of the things that was really important to me, and that honestly I'm really proud of, is that this book is my voice. I did not allow the publisher to edit the content at all. The title, the artwork on the cover, that was all me. So this truly is my story in a multitude of ways. And it was so important to me to be able to bring that forward to help other people who may be experiencing this learn from what I went through and have some insight into how best to navigate so that they don't go on the same journey that I did.
Yes, and because I read your book, I saw so many insights that I believe would help a lot of people for sure. So how do people find out more about your book? Where could they order your book?
Sure. So, like every good book, it is on Amazon. But you can learn more about the story behind it, and some of what I'm doing on my website, which is harasshole.com. And one of the things I've become very vocal about is really the need for companies to engage in bystander intervention training as
Yes.
part of same process that they do, right? We have all of the harassment training and all of that. But I think the next step for companies is to teach and educate your employees on how to intervene when they see something in the workplace, right? There's this sort of safety net of mutual accountability that we all need to have. And I think that people don't know what to do if you see something happen. It may not happen to you, right? It's the old saying, right? It's not me, it's you. But when you have that Houston, we have a problem moment, I think most people don't know how to handle it in the workplace or what to do. And so I really want to help educate people on the steps they should take when they see something and how they can intervene both directly and indirectly without getting dragged into it if they're not comfortable with that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Lisa, if somebody wanted to reach out to you because they're experiencing workplace harassment, or they want to get a hold of you because they want to publish your book or something like that, I mean, your book is published, but I'm talking about like a publisher taking it on, or somebody wants to interview you because you have quite the story. What's your best contact information? How do you like to be reached?
Sure. So I would say if you are contacting me with something regarding my story, if you've got a similar story you want to talk, Lisa Bowman author at gmail.com. And I'm laughing when you talked about somebody wanting to publish it. Listen, if anybody wants to make a movie, if Sandra Bullock is listening to this, I think you would be awesome to play me
She
in
is
the
a good
movie version.
actress. Oh, I love it. Or even Julia Roberts, right?
I think she's too tall. On a good day, I'm only 5 feet, maybe 5'4" with some heels on. But yeah, I often used to play a game with friends of like, if we were making a story or a movie about the story of our lives, who would we have play us? And so in my case,
That's a good one.
it's Sandra Bullock. So
Yeah. Lisa, I'd like to thank you. We are out of time again.
John, thank
You're
you for
such a
having me.
courageous person. And I wish more people were like you. And instead of being bitter and upset, you're reaching forward to help other people. Thank you for that.
John, thank you. Thanks for having me again. It was a pleasure talking.
Yes. And all the best to you as you move forward. I'm Dawn Westbourne, your talk host, coming from Asheville, North Carolina, WPVM FM LP 103.7, the voices of Asheville. Stay empowered.